Guys, let's start things off easy today, because what you're about to hear is going to make you question everything you know about modern medicine. Do you think doctors have always been these ethical professionals we know today? Well, I've got some bad news for you. For centuries, practices that we would consider heinous crimes today were not only accepted, but taught at the world's best universities. And when I say horrible practices, you have no idea what's coming. So buckle up, because this journey through medical history is going to be pretty disturbing. Imagine for a second that you're sick in the 18th century and you decide to see the best doctor in town. This doctor, trained at the finest schools, looks at you and says, "Ah yes, I know exactly what you need. I'm going to drill some holes in your skull to let the demons out." Yes, folks, trepanation was a legitimate medical practice. Doctors literally drilled holes in the skulls of living patients, without anesthesia obviously, because they believed this cured everything from headaches to demonic possession. The sound of the drill boring through skull bone while the patient screamed was considered music to these professionals' ears. But you think that's bad? Wait until you hear what's coming next. During the Victorian era, if you were a woman who dared to have your own opinions or, God forbid, felt sexual pleasure, you would be diagnosed with hysteria. And what was the standard treatment recommended by doctors? Complete removal of the uterus. That's right. Doctors ripped out the reproductive organs of perfectly healthy women because they were too emotional or too sexually active. Thousands of women died on operating tables because the medicine of that time considered femininity a disease that needed to be cured. But it gets even worse when we discover that these same doctors used medical vibrators to treat other patients, claiming that orgasms cured hysteria. Basically, Victorian medicine alternated between mutilating women or legally raping them, all in the name of science. Now, if you think these practices stayed in the distant past, you're very wrong. In the early 20th century, lobotomy was considered the most advanced treatment for mental illness. Walter Freeman, an American neurologist, traveled the entire country in a van he lovingly called the lobotomobile, performing mass lobotomies. The procedure consisted of sticking an ice pick-like object through the corner of the eye, hammering until it broke through the bone, and stirring the brain like it was a milkshake. Freeman managed to do 20 lobotomies in a single day, like it was an assembly line of brain destruction. The most disturbing part: he held public demonstrations, inviting journalists and other doctors to watch while he turned people into human vegetables. One of these victims was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future President John F. Kennedy, who was lobotomized at age 23 because her father thought she was too difficult. She spent the rest of her life incapacitated, hidden from the family in an institution. But do you want to know what was one of the most insane medical practices that ever existed? Malaria fever therapy. That's right. Doctors intentionally infected patients with malaria to cure other diseases. Julius Wagner-Jauregg, who even won a Nobel Prize for this, discovered that the high fever caused by malaria seemed to improve some symptoms of syphilis. So naturally, doctors started injecting blood from malaria patients into anyone who showed up at the hospital with neurological problems. The reasoning was, if fever cures one disease, let's give fever to everyone. The result: patients died either from malaria or syphilis, but at least the doctors were trying something innovative. And speaking of medical innovation, let's talk about the golden age of experimental medicine in the United States. During the first half of the 20th century, American orphanages were basically human farms for medical experiments. Doctors tested experimental vaccines, unapproved drugs, and radioactive treatments on orphan children because, well, who was going to complain? One of the most common practices was feeding children radioactive cereal to study the effects of radiation on digestion. Thousands of children were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, developing cancers years later, all because doctors wanted to see what would happen. The most shocking part is that These practices continued into the 1970s, and many of the victims are still alive today, dealing with the consequences of having been human guinea pigs as children. But perhaps the most sinister medical practice that ever existed was forced sterilization. Between 1907 and 1963, more than 64,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized by doctors who believed in eugenics. If you were considered mentally deficient, too promiscuous, or simply too poor, doctors could legally sterilize you without your consent. Carrie Buck, a 17-year-old girl, was sterilized because a judge decided that she, her mother, and her daughter represented 3 generations of imbeciles. In reality, Carrie was an intelligent young woman who had been raped by the nephew of the family that raised her, but that didn't matter to the medical system of the time. The Supreme Court even approved these sterilizations with the famous phrase, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." This decision directly inspired the Nazi sterilization laws that would come later. Speaking of Nazi inspiration, you know that Nazi medical experiments weren't a historical anomaly, right? They were the logical evolution of practices that had existed for decades in the Western world. American and European doctors studied and admired German methods of racial hygiene. American universities sent students to learn from Nazi doctors. When the Nuremberg trials happened, Nazi doctors used as their defense the fact that they were just following practices that were already common in the United States and Europe. And you know what's most disturbing? It worked. Many Nazi doctors received light sentences because the judges recognized they weren't doing anything very different from what was already accepted in Western medicine. Even after World War II, when the whole world swore never again, horrible medical practices continued. The scariest culture project used respectable doctors to conduct mind control experiments on psychiatric patients. Donald Juan Cameron, a renowned Canadian psychiatrist, received CIA funding to completely erase patients' memories and try to reprogram them like they were computers. He put patients in induced comas for weeks, played recordings on loop 24 hours a day, and applied massive electric shocks to destroy their personalities. Many patients came out unable to remember their own names, like children who had to relearn everything from scratch. Entire families were destroyed because doctors wanted to play God with the human brain. And here's the part that's going to make you lose sleep. Many of these practices haven't stopped completely. They've just evolved and hidden behind more sophisticated terms. Conversion therapy to cure homosexuality still happens in many places around the world, using techniques that are basically psychological torture. Unnecessary surgeries on intersex children continue to be performed to normalize their bodies. Medical experiments on vulnerable populations still happen, especially in developing countries, where big pharmaceutical companies test drugs without adequate supervision. The truth is that medicine has always been a field where power concentrates in the hands of a few, and throughout history, that power has been used to oppress, torture, and exploit society's most vulnerable. What you heard today, in isolated historical aberrations, they're systematic patterns that have repeated century after century, and the most frightening thing is knowing that probably 100 years from now, future generations will look at some of our current medical practices with the same horror we feel hearing these stories. So tell me in the comments, which of these practices shocked you the most? Do you think we've really evolved that much? Or are there still current medical practices that will be considered barbaric in the future? And if you want more disturbing content about the dark sides of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because I have many more stories that will make you question everything you believe about the world. See you next time, folks.